I'm Nick Westergaard, and this is On Brand, helping you tell your story. Most managers aren't failing. They're just guessing. This episode, I'm joined by Ashley Hurd, former head of HR North America at McKinsey, national keynote speaker, top 10 business podcast host, and LinkedIn top voice, who's trained more than 250,000 managers. Her new book, The Manager Method, introduces a simple 3-step approach: pause, consider, act, for leading with confidence, supporting your team, and avoiding burnout. My interview with Ashley is coming right up. But first, Ashley Hurd, welcome to On Brand.
Thank you, Nick. I'm so happy to be here.
I am thrilled to chat. And, we were talking about all the different directions that we could go here. And one first question, because I don't like to say like full academic. I'm a practice track, a pracademic. But still, I'm in a management department talking about management. And I know that we get into academic conversations about management versus leadership. And I feel like today we, leadership is the lofty aspiration. Everyone is a leader, but also the world needs managers. So I just wondered, is someone working directly on this? Is there a nomenclature shorthand that you use in weighing these two big, important terms?
Sometimes I'll describe the two as managers. I think our management is getting things done on the to-do list, but leadership is all the people actually doing the work. Other ways of saying it is management is making sure things get done today. Leadership is what happens tomorrow and the rest of the days. And, there's all sorts of ways you can do it, but a huge part about it is really thinking about the people beyond just the spreadsheet or the checklist or that, and the ripple effects and how they play out for you as a manager or leader, or all the other titles that mean that you're responsible for other people's jobs and careers, of how that gets done, and also the impact that it has for their career, their work, their life outside of work, and your own.
So it kind of outside of your work, it has a ripple effect, and that can be powerful at small organizations. It can really scale at larger organizations. In your work, you've trained over 250,000 managers. At that level, putting up those kind of numbers, what are the macro observations that you saw on the work of managers, and what did that make you think was maybe missing?
What I saw was missing a lot is this idea of how to actually be a manager, what to say, what to do, and why that matters. I mean, going back to the academic piece, there are plenty of leadership programs. I've done some of them, some very expensive ones. And I'm there. Sometimes I didn't necessarily understand the words that were being used. It very much felt like corporate speak, or it felt really lofty. Or even if it felt great in the moment, I moved on with life. And there wasn't much of the connection between, okay, but this is what you do and say in the moment. Or you have managers that get plopped into the role. Often you've done a really good job at your job, like as an individual contributor. So you're great at what you do. You're a top seller. You're a call center person. For whatever reason, oh, we're going to make you a manager. So you're going to teach everybody else how to do it. Okay, well, then someone gets into the role and they look around, and often there isn't much training, but you hear things like, oh, you're responsible for performance, engagement, retention. But there isn't this connection, one, in real talk conversation, the way I think many people actually think and want to speak, but also, okay, so if my best performer comes to me and says, well, I need to be out unexpectedly and that's the middle of a key project, literally, what do I actually do? What do I have to do? And so a lot of what I do in leadership is thinking about that, is flipping the script from so many times as a manager, people think, okay, what do I have to do? And instead to think about what can you do? What are the options? And how can you think about the decisions you make and how that will affect things, like not just talking in performance and retention, but how someone cares about their job, whether they want to come back to work tomorrow, and really thinking about the human motivations behind that, but in real talk. And that's where I really saw a gap. And I saw this gap when I was at McKinsey. I saw these senior partners, some of them were terrific leaders. Others, as I looked at them, I thought, you may have 5 Ivy League degrees, but I also worked at Yum Brands, KFC, and I know restaurant managers that could teach you so many things about driving business and also motivating the people on your team. They wouldn't think that they were worthy of your time, perhaps, or you wouldn't think you have much in common, but you really do. And so that's why I wanted to start the business to give practical tips that I really see as applicable across every type of industry.
I love that comparison, and that's why I think there's like you said, there are big programs that we put a lot of stock in, but then there's also some powerful frontline work. So your book is the manager method, and I love 3 steps. I'm a big believer, and that's about you talk about being at trainings and um, leaving, and is anything sticking? Do I have anything still? And it can with distance, it sometimes dissolves. And I'm a big believer in the idea of the power of 3, because that's about what most of us can hold in our brains these days. So you've got pause, consider, and act. I'm really intrigued by that first step of pausing. So why is that an important first step?
Well, I don't want to play favorites among my 3 children in this step. And this is one thing I took away from McKinsey is the power of 3. I mean, I don't think you were legally allowed to make a PowerPoint presentation, of which there were many made at McKinsey, without having 3. So took that away. But pause to me is really the most important step, in part because it's the one that people often forget, but it is the one that can make such a difference. And why I say that is so many times you're a manager, you're trying to get through the day, maybe 8:30 version of yourself made this to-do list, thought everything's going to happen. 8:37 version has no idea who that person was because now everything's coming at you. And as a manager, whether you're newly promoted or you've been a seasoned executive for years, you often feel like you need to have the answers and you need to make decisions. And oftentimes cultures, whether it's the ones that in the job description say we're a fast-paced culture, or as you work there, you feel like everything is a race to reply first, and it's the speed of the inbox. It just feels like everything has to happen really quickly. And it's not an idea to stop progress or action. Action obviously is really important at work, but just sometimes it's taking a pause. In the pause, it's about what you actually do. And that pause can literally be a second. Sometimes it's more than that. But it's this idea of so many times we just go and we react and we do, but we're not considering, okay, the few words I say, how if I'm a little more thoughtful about them, that can have much more ripple effect and save me so much time far after.
I think I love that. And I think even in conversation too, we're so quick to just keep going. And here people are listening to this in the podcast form, and kind of my rabbit hole is when I started this as an audio podcast, one of the best practices was taking the pauses out of these conversations, even and especially like between, where
Yeah.
the dialogue was happening. And I don't do that. One, because we're making video now, and that's just too hard for me. And it would look a little weird, all these jump cuts, but I think it's an important part of the dialogue as well. So I love that you called these your children. We've talked about pausing. Take us to consider.
Okay. So consider is questions. Okay. You do your pause. Great. Okay. I did my pause. I have a blank space in my mind for a second. That might be the only time that happens today. What do I do in that second or longer? And that is to use it to consider. So they go together neatly. And the consider is to think about not just yourself and the information that you have or the reaction that you have. Like if someone makes a mistake, for example, You are so pissed because now this is going to look badly on you. You knew to yourself, I should have just done this myself. You bring all of this frustration and emotion that may not even have to do with that person as much as it does just feeling the pressure and taking it out on that person. But when you consider, okay, I say sometimes consider how you'd want to be treated if you're on the other side of that conversation or a loved one. Sometimes I use, or often I use Gigi, my late grandmother. She lived 96 amazing years. And I say Gigi was absolutely wonderful. If Gigi were in the workplace, she probably would also make mistakes. Everybody does at some point. But how would you want someone to be treated? And I say all this because it's not to say that managers are sociopaths and you can't think about anybody but yourself. But often you're not, one, taking a pause, or two, thinking about, okay, what might I not know? Or what's the perspective? And sometimes if you think to yourself, okay, right, well, I have made a mistake before. And I remember my boss came down on me and I vowed in that moment never to be that kind of boss, manager, coach, whatever you want to call it. And now all of a sudden I've become that person and I get where my boss was coming from, but I wish someone had just asked me a question or knew the pit that was in my stomach for long before I hesitated to tell them about that mistake, because that's often what happens. And so if you consider, okay, this person coming to you, they likely struggled and are dreading this conversation with you so much. And it's when you act, because act is the third step. I'll jump and give my other child is to actually do something about it. So sometimes act is in that moment, think, okay, what are you going to do? And if someone makes a mistake, you don't want to be the type of manager that just says like, oh, don't worry about it if it's not a big deal. And some do. And inside you're thinking to yourself, okay, well, I'll just take that off their plate. I don't want to be a jerk, but they can't do this. I don't feel like having the conversation, but I'll just do this myself moving forward. So that's probably not the right action because that's not really going to solve anything. You're going to do more work and they're not going to learn. On the flip side, acting doesn't mean coming in hot after them. Sometimes it is. It's asking them questions. Okay, what happened? Walk me through this. In reiterating, if something's really important, okay, well, this is important. This is why. What can we do now to fix it? And how can we make sure this doesn't happen again? And sometimes the act is even more like, okay, if someone does something and you're like, wow, that's actually, I can see why that happened. This is actually a lesson that other people on the team need to know. And so talking to your team member and saying, look, can we talk about this in a team meeting? And again, this isn't to embarrass you. And I'd love to talk about what happened, what you learned, how we got through it, all of these things as a real learning experience. And a good way to do that is, even before someone on your team makes a mistake, is to do that yourself with your team and say, when people make a mistake, I'll talk to you. We'll try to figure out what we can. Again, sometimes it's gonna be a tougher thing to get through, but I'll talk about when I made a mistake and what we learned from it. And so when you all do, I may ask you at some point, okay, can we talk about this as a team? And this isn't about feeling ashamed. It's about this is how we actually learn. And so all that together, that's just one example, but I say in any situation as a people manager, pause, consider, act can help you, again, not take much more time, not have to request any budget, but have conversations and decisions that aren't always easy, but they're a lot more practical and effective in managing your team. And they can also lead to a regret or having to apologize later, or your best team member walking out the door because you could have handled it a bit differently.
On Brand will be right back after this. Now, back to the show.
So you've taken us through this very valuable framework. And one question I have is, burnout is such a challenge today. How does a framework like this help us to avoid one of the most challenging things in the modern workplace today?
Some of this is thinking about the term burnout. And when I say that, one thing I think is really important is the power of words. And again, just like the things you say to your team, if you're going to say things like, I have feedback for you, or you need to be held accountable, people immediately tend to assume the worst in that. And likewise, as a manager, leaders hearing burnout may roll their eyes and think everybody's burnt out these days because nobody wants to work anymore. And so a lot of this is just making these assumptions. And so some of this is pausing and thinking to yourself, okay, what does this actually mean? In recognizing sometimes there are team members that there is just the expectations that you've put on them, or you and others, you don't even realize how much they have going on. it really just isn't realistic, and nobody could actually do it. And so as a leader, it can be really hard because one of the things you often have to do in management is not just manage your team, but also you're managing up. You generally will have your own boss. Even the CEO tends to have a board of directors, shareholders, all the people that, they're accountable to, and a good and bad way. But so some is thinking to yourself, okay, if burnout often means things like, my team has so much work, they're not getting it done, or our team is leaner. I mean, layoffs have been hitting every industry, especially tech industry has been hit incredibly hard. And so you have teams that they look around and they're like, we have half the people, but somehow we're expected to do twice as much as we were doing before. So help me make this have sense. And so as a manager, it really matters that you have conversations to have first a real sense of what's going on. In the book, I say sometimes your team thinks that you are an octopus and a wizard. And what I mean by that is your team often thinks that you have 8 arms. You are able to juggle everything. I mean, I remember times when I would think to myself, my boss is right next door to me, and sometimes it's really hard to get time with him, or I feel guilty. You never know when to step in. And at once I was over in his office and he was like, oh, look at this email. And I saw his inbox. I was like, oh my God, I'd never seen. I'm like, you don't always have a sense of what your manager is working on. And like anybody, you think what you're working on and you need feedback or you need approval. It's really important. But knowing your manager doesn't always have a sense of what you're working on, and you don't always have a sense of what your manager is working on. And so I say that one, managers, it's important to talk to your team about how you balance things as well. And then also not being a wizard is you probably don't have a full picture of everything going on with your team members. And I mean that in a workload and also a personal life aspect. And from the personal life, people are going to vary in what they want to share, what they're going to choose and not choose to share. But you generally don't have a full sense of what's going on. And so one of the things that can be most helpful is checking in with your team, having scheduled one-on-one time with your teams where you can give attention. If you're in an office corporate type environment, that's probably in person or remote, but having that scheduled. If you're on your feet environment, retail, restaurant, healthcare, that just may be a few minutes, between shifts. But whatever that looks like, your team knowing that you're going to come to them really matters. Because otherwise, if you have this culture that's like open door, people can find me, people often do get burnt out because they feel like they're taking on so much and they don't really have any clarity, any guidance. And when they're trying to come to your open door, it always seems to be shut. And so having that time with your team members and really checking in and asking them and explaining to them, because if you give a new project to your team member or tell them something they're going to do, you may be thinking, I'm doing this. I'm building up my team. I'm delegating like I'm supposed to. This is a great opportunity. Well, the person on the other side of that rarely is, without any other context, going to see it that way. Often it's this assumption, okay, well, my boss doesn't want to do this grunt work, so they're handing it off to me. This work doesn't matter. That's why I'm going to take care of it now. Or, my boss is just trying to set me up to fail because they know I'm already overworked. And so when it comes to burnout, and sometimes it's, there's really like mental health challenges to it or real significant things. And it's important for managers to know with your HR and people teams, what do those resources look like and how can we really call attention when our teams are struggling. But even at the outset, understanding the reality of your team members' roles and explaining, I don't want to assume that I know everything going on with you. So I want to check in. How is it realistic? So not just how do you feel coming in on Monday mornings, but on Tuesday afternoons, are you feeling like the work you're going to be able to get things done that you promised? Or is your Friday self hating your Monday self because you claimed you'd be able to do everything and nothing's able to get done? And so burnout, I think a lot of the steps toward burnout are just unrealistic expectations. And so for managers checking in with what you're expecting from your team members, is it realistic and to get done well? And also on the flip side, if it's not, how do you talk to team members about prioritizing? And how do you have those conversations up the organizational ladder to then paint the picture where you're not just complaining and, oh, my team can't do this, everyone's burning out, but to say, this is the impact that it's having. What can we adjust? What can we prioritize so that the most important things can actually get done well?
So much of that is dependent on, as you said, seeing the whole picture. And that's hard because we aren't wizards, which would make everything a lot easier. But one magical tool that we do have is story. And I wonder if you would say a bit about how story can be a tool that can help leaders to have outsized impact?
I think the concept of storytelling, one is, it is so important. And when people think about, the messages that you've heard from your own leaders and what resonates with you, but sometimes stories doesn't have to be a long treatise. I'll say that from my legal background treatise, or, War and Peace, or a long book. Sometimes it's just having a few words of context and giving that explanation. I mean, one thing I think can be really helpful is going back to this idea of like mistakes, is having a manager talk about, again, let's talk about this and talk about when we make mistakes, not if. I mean, already that's a story, because you're telling your team with that sentence, or maybe two sentences of, it's not this theoretical, like, okay, if somebody makes a mistake, but don't really do it, I don't really mean it. But you're saying when. You are completely changing what the expectations look like. And then saying, okay, what can we do to minimize the mistakes? What happens? What causes mistakes? You are opening up conversations and inviting team members to talk about that. And then to tell your own story, for example. Like, I'll tell you about a time I made a mistake, and really get into the emotional aspects of it that resonate with people. Because everybody in the workplace, everybody is operating at times with fear of losing your job. That's a really present fear these days. Also fear of looking ashamed. And so when you talk about things and talk about that, like, oh, I was terrified to tell my boss. I was mortified. I did all these things. And then I had the conversation, and I realized I've been so stressed, and I got the words out, and we got through it pretty quickly. And that changed how I want to lead. And so again, bringing it back to them and thinking about for your team, because what you have sometimes is these leaders, and they'll tell these stories, and you're, oh, that's great. You don't see ever how it ties into yourself. And so as a manager talking about this experience I had, and I was, despite making this mistake that I thought was catastrophic, I would never have a job again, I've since risen to this level. And, having that mistake actually probably helped me get there, because it made me look out for different things. But also, it's important that I tie how this applies to you and what I want you to know. And if you say those things to your team members, because again, a lot of people can maybe listening to this and watching this and saying, oh my God, I had that boss, but they would tell these stories, but it was all about them. I knew details of their mistakes so much, but then I felt like I could never do that. And so making sure that as you're talking about things, it ties into them. And one way to think about that, the other I'll say, is there are also those leaders that you are choosing to share personal information with your team members, but just making sure it's a two-way street. Because sometimes what I have, it's called this like leader-centric communication, where if you've ever had a boss and you think to yourself, I literally know every detail of their 7-year-old's little league season, their batting average and all these things, far more than my own child, because I haven't been able to make a game because my boss always seems to be going to theirs. But I'm supposed to be at my desk for FaceTime until 5:45, 6:30. And so as a leader, when you get involved in things like storytelling, one of the most powerful things you can do is to create that environment where your teams are comfortable sharing stories, whether it's something in their personal life, whether it's about their work, and then remembering it. And rather than coming to them by storytelling, asking questions about that. Because if you remember something that they brought up to you, especially things that have nothing to do with your own life, like they are a cook that makes something that you are highly allergic to, but you ask questions to them about it, you remember people's names, that's some of the storytelling that really is more focused on their story that can make such an impact as a leader.
Such a great point, and really kind of unintentionally comes back to that idea of not being a wizard, not having a crystal ball, not knowing what's in other people's heads. But story as a tool can help us to get on the same page with our people. And some important reminders there on leaving space as well. Well, whether we're talking about wizardry or the three children of this book, I have smiled many times during our conversation. But Ashley, it is now my turn to get to ask you for a brand that has made you smile recently.
I love this question because there is a brand that comes to mind, and that brand is Chiquita of Chiquita Banana fame, because I don't know how recently they started doing this, but they have a sticker on their bananas, and it says, I think, likely the best snack on earth. And I love this because before I worked in HR and started my business, as mentioned, I was a lawyer. And while a lot of what I did was employment law, I did do marketing law for KFC and Yum Brands as part of a rotation. And I know all too well how lawyers are no fun when it comes to advertising. That's thanks for the small print and all of those things. But I have to imagine that was a really funny discussion between marketing and legal at Chiquita to come up with this little sticker that says, likely the best snack. And so anyway, I like when brands and, all the people that came to make that sticker come to life don't take themselves too seriously. And but that cracks me up. So kudos to Chiquita.
That is great. I got to go look at my my bananas after this and think differently about.
Let me ask you this, Nick. I have one question for you back. Did you ever work in a grocery store?
Yes.
Okay. Do you know the PLU code for bananas?
Oh gosh, that's like one of the most common ones and one of the first ones I learned. Is it the same everywhere?
So I think like someone says Costco has different ones and like, okay, well, the Costco needs to get on board because 4011 is the PLU code generally for bananas. I worked at Winn-Dixie multiple decades ago. But we had a test where we had to go and memorize the different PLU codes. And so I really took that to heart. But I laugh. And so once I'd mentioned a couple of years ago something about 4011 and someone said bananas. I said, oh, wait, do other people remember that? And so anyway, I always chuckle at that. That's a branding that PLU code sticks. And I did learn, it is the number one, as I understand it, or at least my Winn-Dixie trainer taught me in 1998 that it is the most popular.
I talk about my grocery experience all the time, especially in management, because I learned there was an employee who was walking around fast with a clipboard, and the manager said he's just taking hot laps to look busy. And I good reminder on we can still do some of that even online here today.
Of course. Hot laps together, Nick.
So where can folks go to learn more about who you are and what you do?
You can go to managermethod.com and pretty much get anywhere from that. At managermethod.com/book, you can get resources for my new book, whether you're reading it on your own or a book club guide if you're reading it as a team. You can find me on pretty much any social media at Manager Method.
Awesome. Well, if it needs to be easier than that for people, if you need one more URL, you can find all of this that we've talked about at onbrandpodcast.com. I laughed at my own joke and triggered a cough as I warned you about early in the episode. But Ashley Hurd, thanks for being on brand with us.
Thank you. Thank you, Nick.
On Brand is part of the Marketing Podcast Network. If you like what you're hearing, if we've made you smile, you can always listen free on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or whatever your favorite platform may be. And please take a moment and rate and review the podcast to help others find the show. Until next week, I'm Nick Westergaard, and I'll see you on the internet.